Welcome to the Kroc Institute's for International Peace Studies 2024 Distinguished Alumni Lecture. My name is Erin Corcoran, and I'm the Executive Director of the Kroc Institute. We acknowledge the Kroc Institute's presence on the traditional homelands of Native peoples, including the Haudenosaunee, Miami, Peoria, and particularly the Pokagon Potawatomi, who have been using this land for thousands of years and continue to do so. We recognize our own place in the story and practices of a colonialism and understand that our responsibilities extend beyond this gesture of land acknowledgement. We also must reflect on the University of Notre Dame's past, present, and future relationship with the original stewards of this land and actively pursue ways to amend this troubled relationship. We also note that a land acknowledgement alone could be meaningless if it is not accompanied by active work to address structural injustice and violence perpetrated against Indigenous people around the globe, both historically and currently. The Kroc Institute is committed to working to address these harms and to find ways to contribute to constructive transformation through our teaching, research, and peace-building efforts. We hope that our celebration today will honor the traditions of these Native peoples as we recognize a guest who is working at the intersection of development, democracy, and peace building. At the Kroc Institute, we are constantly aware that the accomplishments and fascinating career paths of our alumni are a chief source of our pride. Since 1987, when the first 4 undergraduate students were awarded a concentration in peace studies, the Kroc Institute has graduated over 1,900 alumni. This includes over 1,200 from what is now an undergraduate major or minor in peace studies, over 700 alumni in the master's program, and 38 from our doctoral program in peace studies. After 37 years, our alumni now work in over 100 countries around the world. The Kroc Institute's alumni have found a variety of ways to integrate peace studies in their professional work. Some identify as professional peace builders, while others have found ways to incorporate the knowledge and values of peace studies in a variety of distinct professions, from religious leadership to teaching, from journalism to parenting. The Kroc Institute's Distinguished Alumni Award honors graduates of the Notre Dame's Peace Studies programs whose careers and lives exemplify the ideals of peace building across the globe. And just to give you a sense of who we have honored in the past, it's not comprehensive, but it's just meant to sort of give you a flavor of the various different ways our alumni have contributed. So in the past, we've honored Kenyan NGO leader George Wachira, development innovator Molly Kinder, educator and activist Chrisona Wise Whitehead of Baltimore, and then human rights lawyers and advocates, including Xavier Aguirre of the International Criminal Court, Vienna Colucci of Amnesty International, and Adriana Quiones of UN Women. Also, Ambassador Yona Popa of Romania, Chinese filmmaker Yin Yi, Nigerian journalist Obi Anadike, and theater and director writer P. Carl, scholar practitioner Bina de Costa, Valerie Hickey, global director of environment, natural resources, and the blue economy at the World Bank, and Myra Laguro of Catholic Relief Services in the Philippines. To this distinguished list of alumni, we are now privileged to add Jorge Vargas Cullell, Director of Programa Estado de la Nación in Costa Rica. We particularly also want to recognize the support of the Kellogg Institute as a co-sponsor of this lecture. Since completing this Peace Studies program, Jorge has been affiliated with the Kellogg as a dissertation year fellow, a visiting fellow, and guest scholar. And we are delighted to welcome a graduate who so well represents both of our institutes. And now it's my honor to invite Ann Hayner, who is the Associate Director of Alumni Relations at the Kroc Institute, to introduce our 2024 Distinguished Alumni winner. But before I turn the mic over to you, I just want to say this award and the conception of it would not be possible without Ann Hayner. She stays connected to all of our 1,900 alumni around the world regularly, and continues to have meaningful relationships with them and understands the work that they are doing, convenes a committee to look over the vast accomplishments of this alumni network and identify who we are going to award the award to every year, and continues to maintain these important relationships. So I just want to say, Anne, we're so grateful for all that you do. Without you, we wouldn't be able to showcase the alumni in the way that we do. So thank you.
Thank you, Erin. The secret is that I have the best job at the Kroc Institute. We are delighted, as Erin said, to welcome Jorge Vargas of Costa Rica back to the Kroc Institute, to the Keough School, and to Notre Dame. As director of Programa Estado de la Nación, the State of the Nation, he leads a Costa Rican center that conducts research on sustainable development throughout Latin America. As Jorge says, we promote the notion that development is about much more than economic growth. It also involves equity, the environment, democracy, and human rights. In this year in which the focus of the Notre Dame Forum is the future of democracy, it seemed the ideal time to recognize Jorge's work on this topic over the past 3 decades since he first joined the Kroc Institute. In 1994, Jorge graduated from the MA program in Peace Studies as a Fulbright Scholar and began the PhD program in Political Science at Notre Dame. That same year, Estado de la Nación was founded as a collaborative project with the United Nations Development Program. Its goal was to encourage study and discussion of human development in Costa Rica and in Central American countries by improving citizen access to comprehensive, timely, and accurate information on matters of public interest. Reports published by Estado de la Nación, which is now sponsored by a group of Costa Rican universities, are used regularly by policymakers, universities, entrepreneurs, labor unions, and community groups. In a way, we are mediating between very diverse groups with different interests, Jorge says. We try to build a common platform of data and analysis so that they can solve their differences. Jorge, who joined Estado de la Nación in 1996, now supervises a team of 21 researchers who collaborate with a network of nearly 150 scholars throughout Costa Rica and Latin America and Central America. Often, he says, their research brings to light complex issues such as impunity in the legal systems or human rights violations. Information is power, he adds. It enables people to participate in public life in a high-quality way without relying on prejudice. During his PhD studies at Notre Dame, Jorge received several fellowships from the Kellogg Institute, as was previously noted. As an academic researcher, he specialized in the quality of democracy and citizen support for democracy, focusing on Central America. In 2004, he published a volume co-edited with Professor Guillermo O'Donnell titled The Quality of Democracy, Theory and Applications. I understand that the origin of this path-breaking book was actually in a Notre Dame classroom, in a seminar taught by Guillermo O'Donnell on democratic theory. One of the questions explored in this class was whether it's possible to define and determine the quality of democracy. Jorge, a student in this course, returned to his native country of Costa Rica, formed a small research team, and secured funding to undertake a citizen audit of the quality of democracy in Costa Rica. This empirical data then became central to the final book. Each year, Jorge supervises an annual State of the Nation report assessing Costa Rican performance on sustainable development and democracy, as well as biannual reports on the state of education and the judiciary, and periodic Central American reports on the state of regional integration, peace, and development. The program also oversees an internet portal for advancing science, technology, and innovation in Costa Rica. Jorge, I now invite you to stand to receive our recognition. We are honored to welcome you back to the Kroc Institute to address the topic, the uneasy relationship of peace, democracy, and human development. reflections on the hopes and disappointments of Central America's peace agreements, and to present you with a symbol of our respect. The Kroc Institute is proud to recognize your commitment to peace building, democracy, and development through research and dialogue with diverse members of the community, from business executives to labor leaders, from local activists to heads of state. We are honored to confer on you the Distinguished Alumni Award of the Kroc Institute. As inscribed on the base of the award, we are confident you will go forth in peace. Congratulations and welcome back to the Kroc.
Good afternoon. It is impossible for me to begin with this talk without thanking the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the Keough School for Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame for selecting me as the 2024 recipient of the Kroc Institute Distinguished Alumni Award. I must say that the news came as a complete surprise to me on a placid December morning, which in contrast to the normally cold and gray skies here in South Bend, are sunny and warm in Central America. The prelude for the end of the year prolonged holidays of our dry season. It was a very happy surprise, I might add. In particular, I would like to thank the Distinguished Alumni Committee, Usher Kaufman, the Kroc Institute Director, and Anna Hegner for her kind words. Here, I am honored and humbled to be with you. The title of my talk is The Centrality of Political Power for Advancing Peace, Democratization, and Human Development, Reflections on the Central American Extrication from Military Conflicts and Structural Violence. Let me add now, largely failed extrication, because in truth, contemporary Central Americans have been incapable to build upon the once-in-a-century historical opportunity to effect societal change through peaceful means. Why? Why did peace processes in Central America fail to deliver on the promise of better, more just, and democratic society? This is precisely the substance of my talk. For starters, a quick reminder. In 1987, at a time when civil wars, revolutions, and counter-revolutions had been raging in the region for the best of the decade, 5 Central American presidents signed the Esquipulas Agreement in Guatemala against all odds. After years of squabbling with each other, the presidents unexpectedly agreed upon a strategy for a peaceful solution to the civil wars, for holding democratic elections, and rejecting both the intervention of extra-regional powers and the meddling in each other's internal affairs. That these individuals were able to come up with such an agreement came as a surprise to many, for me in particular, because the US administration, the most powerful actor in the conflicts, had been hardly pressing them not to do so. These presidents were ideological foes, some allied to the Reagan administrations at subverting a neighboring government while helping another to fence off an insurgency. Others depended squarely upon the US government to fight against insurrection. At least one was allied to Cuba and the Soviet Union, and the Costa Rican president, the main promoter of the agreement, was desperately trying to extricate the country from an extremely vulnerable position. A whole literature exists with contending explanation on how the Esquipulas Agreement was possible against the geopolitical backdrop of the Cold War and the narrow structure of political opportunity. Reviewing it is not within the scope of this lecture, but let me just say that these people, these presidents, were keenly aware that the Reagan administration was largely a spent force, that Nicaragua could not count anymore on the Soviet Union to withstand insurgency amid signs of that the Cold War was receding, and that none of them stood to win from the prolongation of the armed conflicts. And crucially, they shared the belief that only Central Americans could really understand and do something to stop the bloodshed. And I have spoken personally to many of them. And that's my sense, that if they could not find a solution, nobody would do it for them, and that the outcome would be catastrophic for the Central Americans for the decades to come. Building upon the Esquipula framework, 3 countries went on to sign national peace accords. In 1988, the Nicaraguan Sandinista government and the US-backed Contra signed the Zapoá agreements, which ended the war, granted amnesty, and scheduled democratic elections for the near future. In 1992, the government of El Salvador and the Frente Farabundo Martí para la Liberación Nacional signed a wide-ranging peace agreement, which included changes to the constitution, the restructuring of the armed forces and its natural security doctrine, the subordination of the military to civilian power, the strengthening of the judiciary, as well as an array of social and economic programs. Finally, in 1996, the Guatemalan government and the Unión Revolucionaria Nacional Guatemalteca signed the peace agreement by which the latter gave up arms in exchange for certain political guarantees and minimal social programs. Of the 3, the Salvadorian case was hailed for many years as the most comprehensive and successful one. These peace agreements ended civil wars in Central America and were met with huge hope and expectations in societies ravaged by decades of instability, social exclusion, and political violence. And here I'm not only referring to Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala, the societies which actually experienced civil wars, but also to Honduras, Costa Rica, and even Panama, who were deeply affected in many political, social, and economic ways by the conflicts. Central America is too small. Just bear in mind that before the civil wars, the intra-Central American trade amounted to more than 50% of the international trade for the Central American countries, and that the war stopped that abruptly. Arms trafficking, border incidents, drugs for arms dealings, economic and social crisis had ignited tensions everywhere. The whole region, and not only the societies experiencing directly the military conflicts, was on the brink. So when peace came along, we cheered. That was our opportunity to do things differently, to leave the authoritarian legacies behind, to do something to ameliorate structural inequalities and extend poverty. For Costa Rica in particular, for decades, the only democracy in the region, this was a golden opportunity to help building democracy in the neighborhood, no longer an endangered species surrounded by tin pot dictators. Even more, in the aftermath of the 1989 US invasion to Panama, which resulted in the removal of General Noriega, an ex-CIA agent turned drug trafficker and dictator, our president, Oscar Arias, convinced the new Panamanian leaders to abolish the army as a permanent institution, creating an international space without military forces. All the Central American countries, including Belize, went on to sign the Tegucigalpa Protocol in 1991, which relaunched the Central American integration process. And in 1994, they followed on it with the Sustainable Development Alliance, ALIDES, which defined economic progress, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability as the key pillars of the regional integration effort. Many Central American leaders thought, and I agreed with them at that time, that finally the region was taking definite steps to extricate itself from its violent and deeply unsettling past. However, this hard-fought peace did not usher a new era of shared prosperity and democratization that many of us thought was inevitable. After all, I thought at the time, who would like to keep alive the causes that led to such terrible conflicts? Instead, by the turn of the century, it became increasingly clear that the absence of military conflict coexisted with high levels of social violence, structural inequalities, persistent public corruption, and stunted democratization. Moreover, in the last decade, the region has seen dramatic democratic backsliding and breakdown, as well as a new lost decade in terms of economic and social development. Let me briefly present some key stylized facts of our current predicament. 3 decades after the extrication of the civil wars, or the partial extrication, only one full democracy continues existing in the region, Costa Rica. We have 2 full-blown authoritarian regimes, Nicaragua and El Salvador, 2 hybrid, deeply flawed regimes, Honduras and Guatemala, and an imperfect democracy in Panama. 3 decades after the peace agreements, long-term economic growth remains low in most Central American countries, particularly in Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras, where 80% of the regional population lives. The exception is Panama, an outstanding performer, but only 5% of the Central Americans live there. More than 50% of the regional populations continues living in poverty, official figures. Maybe realities may be even worse. And the figure is higher today than a decade ago. And citizen support for democracy is falling, and in a minority in most Central American countries. The biggest share are people who hold deeply ambivalent attitudes toward democracy and or do not mind if an authoritarian comes to power if that means that he or she will fix their problems. Just a quick note. In pointing out these key facts, I am not implying that the past 3 decades have been completely inconsequential, that 2024 is basically 1990 all over again. Absolutely not. A degree of economic and social development has ensued during the period. International trade and foreign investment has flown into the region, and peace in the sense of the absence of interstate war of civil armed conflict has prevailed, not a small feat in a region that has previously been caught in a never-ending, iterating cycle of political violence and instability, going back to independence in the early 19th century. What I am saying is whatever progress and development we experience since the peace agreements have been clearly insufficient to address the social inequalities and exclusion that plague most Central American societies. States' apparatuses remain weak and largely incapable of meeting social and basic social and economic demands, with the partial exception of Costa Rica and Panama, and that citizens took note on these failures, either voting with their feet and emigrating, or basically soaring up to democracy and embracing authoritarian leaders. This as much has been documented by our State of the Region reports, as well as by all the specialized literature and reporting about Central America. Why again this failure to combine peace, human development, and democracy? Before delving into the last more intricate and possibly abstract part of my talk, let me tell you 2 stories, which in a way signal how personal accounts are woven into the intricate tapestry of social trajectories. I do think that these connections help us understand why societal outcomes have also very personal meanings. Both stories, I think, are relevant to the case I will try to argue here. The first story unfolded on January the 16th, 1992, the day in which the peace agreement between the government of El Salvador and the Farabundo Martí guerrillas was signed at the Palacio de Chapultepec in Mexico City with the United Nations Secretary Office as broker. After years of complex and winding negotiations, the agreement was supported by most European and Latin American countries, especially the Central American ones, but largely, although not always, opposed by the US government. Just let me add in passing that the choosing of the Palacio de Chapultepec, the Chapultepec Palace, as a place for the ceremony was not an innocent one. It was symbolically loaded. It not only meant to underscore the critical role that the Mexican government had in the whole process, but something more. The Chapultepec Palace, a 19th century building, stands in the place where the Aztec emperors, the Tlatoanis, had their summer residence. The Tlatoanis were at the political apex of a cultural region we nowadays call Mesoamerica, which in pre-Hispanic times include the territories of today's central and southern Mexico, most of Guatemala, Honduras, the Pacific seaboard of Nicaragua, and of course also included El Salvador. It escaped to none of the Central Americans involved and present at the Chapultepec that the palace gave the whole event a deep and unifying historical connection to the parties in conflict, and a metaphor conveying the image that this common thread could help them find solutions to protracted conflicts. Peace agreements, as with any infrequent and extraordinary political act, need to forge an intricate imagery to place the concrete act within the greater forces of history. They need symbols. Choosing an emblematic place, the Chapultepec, for instance, signal to many that the act was not an improvised, offhand event, but that one that is deeply rooted in the social fabric and in a way is restoring things finally to the proper place. On that January 16th, 1992, it happens that I was at El Salvador, San Salvador, El Salvador's capital city, as part of a mission of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. Coming to a country at war entailed some risk, particularly when the US government was an actor to the conflict. Since one arrived to El Salvador, the presence of the military was overwhelming, with road blockades, tanks, and trenches here and there. It was not my first time in El Salvador, a country which I had visited many times during the 80s, sometimes as an official of the Costa Rican government, sometimes as a member of the university delegation, or as part of an NGO. I knew the drill, the dangers, the ways in which one had to carefully move around the capital, never go to the countryside where the actual combats were taking place. Nonetheless, I still remember the explosions and bombs that peppered the Salvadorian nights. One golden rule: always be very careful with whom you talk and meet with, and always inform your partners where were you going, at what time, and would you return. And of course, zip your mouth with taxi drivers. As soon as the news broke out that the peace agreement had been signed at the date, time, and place it had been announced, everybody had been hedging their bets in case of an unexpected last-minute catastrophe. All forms of happiness broke loose in the city. I have never had the experience, and never since had, of feeling that over the course of few hours, happiness could actually be touched. Happiness, not an ethereal feeling, but as solid as hard rock. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of people were dancing and cheering in the streets in places where just a few hours before were extremely dangerous just to walk by. I witnessed the first public transmission of Radio Farabundo Martí, the main clandestine voice of the insurgency, in the Plaza Central in front of the cathedral. In the meantime, the government supporters party was being held just a block away. and the famous Salvadorian orchestra of the Hermanos Flores was playing merengues and salsa non-stop to a happy crowd. And people wandered from one place to another, frictionless, no fights whatsoever broke between people who just a few weeks before would have killed each other for political reasons. A couple of days later, I was drinking beer at the Puerto La Libertad, eating oysters with an extremely intelligent Salvadorian who was then in charge of the housing policies at that country, and over time became to be the very powerful Salvador's Minister of Security. He, a lawyer, told me, Jorge, the peace agreement is our first shared constitution. It is the first time in our history the law is not a weapon of one part of society against the other. Not an imposition, but the first time we Salvadorians have been able to agree on peace and societal change. And then he added, and I remember his words, and we will deliver. We cannot fail. Well, not quite. Fast forward 3 decades, and I, Jorge Vargas, is no longer a young man. In January 2022, the Salvadorian government labeled the 1992 peace agreement a force. It was not a mere political expression. Congress approved a decree abolishing the annual commemoration, arguing that the agreement had not brought peace to the country. It had been farcical. Moreover, the Monument for Peace, built in 2017 to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the peace agreement, was demolished a couple of months ago, as ordered by the current president of El Salvador. And sadly to say, and this is very sad to say, in rewriting history, erasing from the public space all the traces of the peace agreement, the current Salvadorian government had a point. In the 3 decades in between both acts, almost 100,000 Salvadorians had been killed by social violence, mainly spearheaded by the dreaded Maras. Several hundreds of thousands others had been forced to emigrate due to violence and lack of economic and social opportunities, and many had to labor every day paying extortions just to walk in the neighborhood or to take the bus back to or from work, to exempt the children from being raped or recruited as mareros. And let me add something which came to me as shocking. Apart from some scattered protest, the majority of society simply shrugged off the shoulders. When the government rewrote history and threw the peace agreement into the dustbin, few cared. A big bang ended in a blip. On the simple stroke of a pen, history had been ghosted away. Why? Before delving into this question, the substance of my talk, I want to jump into the second story, a shorter one, I hope. In 1997, some months after returning to Costa Rica as an ABD from the Government Department of Notre Dame, as it was then called political science, I was dashing between different Central American countries, interviewing scores of people in trying to understand how they saw the situation and perspective of the region. I was part of a team who was at the very first stages of the preparation of the first Central American State of the Region Report on Sustainable Human Development, or Estado de la Región, as it is currently known. Its first edition dates from 1999, and we were going to publish the 7th edition next year. At that time, we were picking up on the brains of economic, social, and political leaders just to understand the kind of report that was politically feasible and useful for diverse and most of the time highly conflicted gamut of social, economic, and political actors. We wanted a report which was not only an academic paper, but also a product of a rational conversation within fledgling democratic settings. If we could select topics of shared interest, maybe we could help shaping a common agenda to foster human development. That was our thinking. We were keenly trying to take advantage of the hard-fought peace to connect the Central American intellectuals with the decision makers and de facto powers to elevate the quality of public policies and strengthen the infrastructural power of state institutions. Just an aside, one of the conversations, for example, led me to a tete-a-tete with the head of the military commission of the all-powerful Comité Coordinador of Asociaciones Agrícolas, Comerciales, Industriales y Financieras, the CACIF, the apex business organization in Guatemala, the most powerful, those who have power in Guatemala. I remember him summarizing the conversation as follows. Look, señor, in Guatemala, human rights may very well be, but democracy, definitely not. That's not something fitting into our culture. Well, I thought at the time, at least he thinks human rights have a place under the sun. That was the kind of dialogues we were engaged at the time. Fascinating and very telling of the daunting difficulties of building peace and democracy in hierarchical apartheid structure society of Guatemala. 25 years later, when in 2023, I witnessed all the political and legal maneuvering to impede President-elect Bernardo Arévalo in Guatemala to take office. He had clearly won. I could not help but remember these and other conversations I had so many years before. Foreboding, no doubt. But what I really wanted to share with you was my meeting with a guy nicknamed Modesto in Nicaragua, in Managua, Nicaragua, a few days after the exchange at the CACIF premises. I mean, I went the other extreme. Modesto, as Henry Ruiz was known since the days of the revolt against Anastasio Somoza sultanistic dictatorship, had been one of the 9 comandantes of the La Revolución, or revolutionary commanders, the collegiate structure that led Nicaragua during the first years after Somoza's downfall. Daniel Ortega, the current dictator, was another member. But Modesto was particularly interesting for our endeavor. He was the only Moscow-trained military man and the only Soviet-educated Orthodox Marxist among the commandantes. During the armed uprising, he was the main military strategist, and within the highly decentralized, at the time, Frente Sandinista, a quilt of squabbling factions which only glued a few months before victory, Modesto led the largest and best equipped of the Sandinistas factions. Why didn't emerge as the new Nicaraguan revolutionary leader, I have never quite understood. Maybe there was no chance that during a Reagan era, a Soviet-trained leader would emerge as such in the US backyard. Maybe he had not what it takes to become a frontman, as Daniel Ortega did, in spite of Ortega coming from the weakest Sandinista faction. Leadership is sometimes an arcane matter. I had a long, although nervy conversation with Modesto, a man of few and precise words, always preceded by long silences in which I, as an interviewer, was kept guessing if he was going to throw me out of the house, refuse to answer, or whatever. It was not the case, though. It was simply his shy and bit awkward misdemeanor, as I came to understand along the years. The point is that once I finished with my prepared script, an interview, I told him, I cannot leave your house without asking you one final question. It is not part of the interview, but I find it impossible not to ask. Please remember that the meeting was taking place in 1997, 7 years after the revolutionaries had been thrown out of power after losing a democratic election. The current government was anti-Sandinista, but I must say, Modesto had a public fallout with Daniel Ortega, who had expelled from the Sandinista party all of his critics, Henry Ruiz, one of them, and he was largely engaged with other former revolutionaries and progressive intellectuals in trying to build a new party. Modesto told me, shoot. And then I made my move. If you could go back to 1979, the year you toppled Somoza and the revolution started, what you have done differently? A dense silence ensued, the longest to the day I ever had in any conversation with anybody. And finally, he said, I am going to answer you because the question is inconsequential. Nothing I will tell you will change a bit of our history. And then he added, after a new silence, of course, if I could go back to 1979, the first thing I would do is to create the institutions of the rule of law. Without them, we rot from the top very easy and very quickly. And the second thing I would have done would be not to use expropriations of financial or real estate assets as political weapons to persecute and silence our critics. With what we had confiscated to Somoza was enough to jumpstart a developmental process. I remember thinking, odd response. Herein, an Orthodox Marxist is telling me that the main revolutionary task he could now see with the benefit of hindsight was to materialize a classic tenet of political liberalism in the European sense of the word, not the US. Had he known better, he would have established a strong and independent judiciary, the checks and balance and trappings of democracy. Of course, he was talking about power, the ways in which it is created and lost, and first and foremost, the ways in which it is exercised. These two tales I just shared with you are tales of hope and failure, of the opportunities peace brings with, and also of the high cost of failing to deliver on the expectation, needs, and demands from the population. A lost opportunity is much more than afterthought or a conclusion. It is a tragedy for many. So let us finally go back to the original question. Why did peace agreements in Central America fail to deliver on the promise of better, more just, and democratic society? Why did they largely fail to extricate the region from structural violence? Here is my take. With the partial exception of the 1992 Salvadorian Peace Accord, the scope of the Guatemalan and Nicaraguan agreements were extremely narrow. Basically, they tackled the issue of terminating the armed conflicts and setting up some modicum of political inclusion, that is, conditions allowing insurgents and their allies' forces to participate in the political process, namely elections, without the fear of retribution. In these two countries, with non-trivial varying degrees, governments and the armed forces had been the clear victors. The extreme case is Guatemala, the bloodiest of the conflicts, where the agreement did not include provisions more than vague wording about developmental goals, political reform, ending systemic discrimination against the indigenous population, the majority of the country's population, and of course, no commitment was whatsoever by political and economic elites to redistribute the benefits of economic growth among the poor and the middle classes. The Nicaraguan case is a bit different. Though the Sandinista government militarily, and it was not a complete victory, but had the upper hand, the revolutionary regime was in a vulnerable position. A deep economic and social crisis at home, coupled by the weakening of the international bloc that had supported the Sandinistas, meant that they were forced, this was not a voluntary decision, they were forced to allow an political opening, that is, to schedule heavily supervised elections, which were finally held in 1990. And they lost, by the way. But please note that the whole electoral democratization schedule was not included in the 1988 Sapoa agreement with the counterinsurgency. The peace agreement as such was negotiated in a separate track with international actors such as the European countries, the OAS, and indirectly the US government. As noted, the 1992 Salvadorian Peace Accord was much broader and ambitious than the other two, and involved changes to the constitution to ensure civilian control over the armed forces, changes to its doctrine, separating military and police functions, and weeding out armed forces from human rights perpetrators, though an amnesty law was passed. In addition, it included an international compliance monitoring system, which worked for over the first 5 years after the agreement. It went much farther than just granting political inclusions to the insurgents, in part reflecting the basic fact that the US military was not able to win the war, not the Farabundo Martí either. What the agreement did was finding a way out of a stalemate. but the whole economic and social dimensions, the root causes of the highly exclusionary nature of the Salvadorian society were left largely untouched. Apart from some social assistance programs aimed basically to demobilize guerrillas and some other programs, the business and political elites did not commit themselves to any strategy to ameliorate the structural inequities and lack of progress for the majority of the population. There was this fundamental disconnect between peace and human development, and no public policy framework nor institutional reform was never devised to bridge this gap. It would be wrong, however, to single out the breadth and scope of the peace agreement as the main culprits for what unfolded in the next decade. After all, agreements reflect underlying political realities, that is, underlying distribution of political power and shared understanding about the shape of the structure of political opportunity they represent. From that standpoint, let me address two facts which, with the benefit of hindsight, I have found of particular relevance for our discussion. On the one hand, a cognitive failure stemming from extremely narrow and disconnected visions on how peace, development, and democracy are related, and on the other, a systemic leadership failure from both the domestic and international actors. I will briefly discuss both of them. The cognitive failure. Forget about the lofty speeches and let's get real, we were told, and I vividly remember this. Peace is one thing, development and democracy are two other very different stories, each having its own track. In the end, the pragmatically minded told us, peace is about ending wars. Development is about free markets, international trade, and investment. Go to the IMF and the World Bank. And democracy is about holding free and fair elections, bringing the OAS and the electoral observers. So if elections are successfully held, the rest will follow. That is, we have elections, and then over time, the institutions of rule of law will be erected to some kind of a natural flow. And responsive parties and party system will cater for the demands and needs of the populations. So they told us, let's focus on the essential, more urgent tasks. And these understandings led to an array of strategic mistakes for managing the complex and simultaneous transitions from war to peace, from backward to modern economies, from exclusionary societies to inclusive ones, and from authoritarianism to free and open societies that all these societies have to manage at the same time. It was not a single track, but it's playing chess on a multi-dimensional yes, on the multi-dimensional levels. In a nutshell, at a time when war-torn societies were in desperate need to build up institutions with infrastructural capabilities to implement wide-ranging social and economic policies for human development, to replace the authoritarian, albeit highly incompetent, corrupt, and weak state institution of that the military dictatorships of the past had given us, the prevailing orthodoxies at the time were pushing for the dismantling of state structures, restrictive fiscal policies, privatization, where the mantra in societies where social expenditures amount to less than 10% of their GDP at this small level. We had peace, but no money for education, no money for comprehensive public health, no money to implement wide-ranging employment program. Narrow understanding, conflating democracy with free elections, the minimal procedural conceptions of democracy so dear to the US political science establishment, plus some political liberties, compounded the problem. As far a country was able to organize a relatively free election, it was hailed a democracy. And 2 successive elections, and there you went as a consolidated democracy. Thus, the whole program for building strong and independent institutions of the rule of law, for enforcing open, transparent, and accountable governments, and for opening up the opportunities for citizen participation in the design and implementation of public policy was pushed to the back burner. That was not the urgent task. except for some scale programs and projects. And I remember that was the kind of the seed of my kind of why I began with this issue of the quality of democracy and the citizen. You know, democracy cannot be just by election. I mean, cannot be about organizing elections. We thus had peace and democracies with unreformed, weak, and above all, closed and corrupt state institutions. But democracy was about elections, full stop. The pragmatics forgot that things are interconnected and that the long term is built upon everyday actions beginning today. There is a second failure, is the systemic leadership failure, which is closely related to the cognitive failure, refers to the inability of actors to raise up to the requirement of such an extraordinary occasion as a peace agreement. Put aside the narrow focus on their immediate interests and expand the scope of their political actions aiming to create shared social value with their former opponents, co-setting up long-term human development and democratic goals. I have no time to get into details in each of the three cases, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, have their own specific stories. However, I think there are some common features that stand out, which I will very quickly bullet out. To begin with, the US, the main international investor in the Central American wars, simply opted out when peace was achieved. It put tons of money for pursuing war. It turned to missing in action in the post-agreement setting. No mini Marshall Plan for reconstructing infrastructure, for helping war economies transition to peaceful, vibrant economies, no monies to fund wide-ranging social policies. Even today, Central America, after it was no longer a hot spot, is well under the US radar, except regarding the so-called war on drugs and immigration crisis. The local elites, especially, but not only the business actors, put up stiff resistance to any talk of redistributive policies. That was communism. And in particular, to reforming the regressive tax system full of convenient loopholes, aiming at collecting monies that cash-strapped states desperately needed to fund public policies and infrastructures. The insurgents in turn, and in the case of Nicaragua, the Sandinistas who were in government, in turn were narrowly focused in cementing their place under the sun, to enter into the ordinary politics of horse trading and making their way to power. By itself, that is not problematic, and even a good sign of political normalization. The problem was that there was nothing more in it. That was the whole point. Even in El Salvador, where the Farabundo Martí won elections eventually and inaugurated 10 years of successive governments, they had no specific programs, no clear path of action to effect societal change in a democratic setting. In a way, it is very telling that the best known and more respected figure of all the struggle for ending the Central American wars and open the gates to democracy and peace was a leader that was not party in any of the conflicts, President Arias of Costa Rica, the 1997 Nobel Peace Prize recipient. None of the revolutionary and contra-revolutionary leaders of the time became towering figures in the advocacy for peace. None had the stature. The unfortunate connection between peace, human development, and democracy that follow the peace agreements can be summed up as follows. Those wielding power thought that we could do peace without human development, without improving the opportunities of the majority of the people to live decent, long, and healthy lives. They thought they could get away with it because people would always prefer peace over war, even if that means living miserable lives. Those wielding power, and I'm not only talking about the oligarchies, but also the insurgencies, thought democracy could be possible without redistributing political power without reforming the close oligarchic structures characteristic of most Central American societies. They thought that elections would be enough to satisfy the cravings of many people to participate in public affairs and exercise their rights and liberty. And they were wrong, utterly wrong in clinging into this disconnection. So now what? We in Central America are navigating through the darkest, most complex passage in the past 3 decades. Our regional integration system is in tatters. In Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, the old revolutionary caudillo, has reinstated a sultanistic dictatorship, our own very tropicalized version of North Korea. In El Salvador, young President Bukele has proposed a Hobbesian bargain to citizens: give me your liberty and I will give you security. And the people have upheld the bargain. Leviathan now rules in that country. Honduras continues in its traditional labyrinth, a semi-failed quasi-narco state with no prospects of economic and social development and real democratization. But as always, when the night is dark, there are glimpses of hope, and they are precious. And if successful, they can springboard new efforts to link human development and democracy with the overdue promise of peace. In Guatemala, as said before, against all odds, a new government led by Presidente Arevalo came to power, promising a frontal attack on political corruption, uphold human rights, and the rights and demands of the indigenous population. It is a very tenuous and volatile situation, but one certainly unthinkable only a year ago, even by very optimistic standards. In Costa Rica, the institutions of democracy have been able to weather so far the emergence of a populist, authoritarian inclined president, proving that populism is not an inevitable success. In Panama, the worst threat to democracy, the return of populist ex-president Martinelli to power, has been thwarted, and hopefully the elections will be decided among democratically minded candidates. For sure, these are short-term successes that do not guarantee any long-term progress. The seeds of citizen malaise are everywhere, and we live through dangerous times. In this complex context, though, we have an opportunity to drive home some basic truths and be heard, because many people are looking for answers, for a way out to our sorry state of affairs and to bar a return to the past. And there is where the philosophy of the Q School, of the Kellogg, of the Kroc Institute are really in the front lines. We have to convey the idea once again that democracies hollow out without human development, that we cannot deliver on human development without enhancing the capabilities of the institutions and of a democratic state to promote social and economic policies. That investment and entrepreneurial opportunities flourish in open economies and in open political regimes as well, the former being an insufficient condition. That we need to invest much more in technology and innovation to tackle many of the global and regional challenges such as food security, resilient productive systems, and sustainable cities. That expanding in education is a key non-negotiable condition for any government. I am convinced that wide-ranging political and social support for this idea can be mustered. Entrepreneurs, intellectuals, political leaders, grassroots communities. At the beginning of this talk, I said that we Central Americans have been incapable to build upon the once-in-a-century historical opportunity to effect societal change through peaceful means. Well, true, but in lieu of the dangerous, somewhat desperate situation we are currently facing, I think a new opportunity is emerging, a way out, and that this time we know what to do and how to face it. Thank you.
If there are any questions from audience members, this is your opportunity.
Thank you, Jorge. This was I want to say an excellent talk, but it was also a depressing talk in many ways. Like there is a tension between the quality of the presentation and the gravity of your arguments, I guess. It was an excellent talk. As you were talking and as you were showing us your the process of the peace process, what was lacking from it, I kept thinking about the Peace Accords matrix and the experience in Colombia. I don't know if you know, but I would be interested to know if you can share with us. It seems to me like when they were sitting in Havana and doing writing up the peace accords in Colombia, they may have been thinking about what was not working in Central America. I do not know. But the comprehensiveness of the peace accord, the fact that the United States remained a central player, unlike what you've just told us. For me, I just thought about maybe some lessons were learned from Colombia, and then perhaps this is an opportunity to think backward to the Central American experience and to look at the Colombian case and to say, where could we have done better by looking at the Colombian case? And not that the Colombian piece, the implementation is perfect, but it's been now, how many years? 8 years. 7, 8 years, and it's going on with all its challenges. And I wonder if there is something that you can share with us about from that perspective.
Well, I am not an expert on the Colombian process. My understanding is kind of that even in Central America, people are always looking at their neighbor. I mean, they try to devise strategies and to strategize on their process, but not necessarily to look back and say, well, how can we do things differently? That's my understanding, but I very cautiously assert what I'm saying. Looking back, I mean, the elephant in the room is power. If you don't have clear commitments on who is going to win power, who is going to cede power, to what purpose, then you create kind of a bipolar social process. Then you have the peace track, and then you have normal life. Normal life, anything has changed, continues with the same inertia. But then you want to overimpose this peace track. But for example, very powerful actors say, well, I was not there. I am not obliged by any framework. So then you have all these kind of under the rug or under the table conversations trying to plead with some of the most powerful actors to engage in the process. But I think if you tell me one of the lessons is that you have to not only talk about how to end conflict, which of course you have to do, how to create certain reparations, but what are we going to do with power? In power means many different things. For example, as the Sandinista, they had all the power. I mean, they had destroyed the ancien regime. They had no design of what is the shape of the new state, how you create functioning institutions. That things, not of course for the whole state, because the state is very complex, but certain key enclaves of that state, you really, for example, creating the judiciary, that people know that conflict can be processed. I think that there's and then you have the problem of how to articulate transitional justice with this kind of more regular. You have to do so. And I think you cannot do peace and human development and create democracy has a cost. And elections is in terms of financial and budgetary. If you look at the budgets, when you look at the budget of state, you are looking really at the heart. You are looking at the priorities of that state. If the peace agreement does not permeate those public budgets, I mean, it's just paper. So my point is that if I would, first part of my answer is that I don't think that the Colombians kind of, as a whole, the negotiators from one side or the others were looking at the Central American experience and say, well, we can do something. They were thinking on the Colombian case. Maybe some scholars, I don't know, and I plead ignorance on that. But on the other hand, what I do attest from the Central American experience and being someone that had tried to create some basic infrastructure for connecting peace, development, and democracy, is that if you want democracy, you want development, I had to go to the IMF, to the World Bank, and they talk business. And if you say, well, look, we have a peace problem, and you say, well, I don't know, that's not for me. We don't understand. I'm so sorry. The important thing is that your deficit is within that margin, and your ratio debt to GDP is this, and you have to be very careful with your expenditures. And okay, then you go democracy, and then you go to all the crowd looking for trying to observers of elections, but there's no connection. The connection for me is creating a state that is a state of a democratic state, a state that all people feel that it's their own state. And I think that one of the lessons. The other is that it's in the case of Colombia, it's very different, but in the case of Central America, I mean, war really destroyed a lot of key infrastructures, and there was no money to rebuild anything. There were special programs, small scale, small is beautiful things, but we needed something of the sorts of a mini Marshall Plan, as I said. You need money because the budgets are so small to do anything.
This failure came along with the state.
Yeah, I mean, without the design that state and political power are things that you have to put in the center of your conversation. Who's going to say very clearly, is someone going to cede power, or we are going to play democracy without redistribution power? It's kind of a lottery where there is only one number and that number always wins. And for example, you talk to many Salvadorians and they say democracy is a bad word. That was democracy. I prefer a government that ensures that I can walk in the street safely. Whether it is democratic or not, that's not my concern. So that would be my take. It's of course, Monday morning quarterback. But in my defense, I would say that we really pressed for that at that time, but we were not the dominant voice.
Thanks, Jorge, for the insights. I always thought that the problem of Nicaragua was that the peace accord wasn't really a peace accord. It was just a ceasefire accord, and it didn't have any deep.
Yeah.
Now you're telling us that in El Salvador there was an actual agreement, but the two countries ended up basically in the same situation with an autocrats and lack of rule of law. And I think you kind of mentioned the underground circumstances, lack of human capital and things like that. But I wanted to ask you about what happened in El Salvador after this excitement that you could touch, this happiness of the agreement. Was it a matter of implementation of? Was a matter of putting into laws and budget? You kind of mentioned already in the question, but what happened because this is extremely important for countries that are passing, like Colombia, that are going through a past agreement process and basically fail. So, what comes next after the agreement?
I think that the Salvadorian case is really intriguing because they were really far-reaching in many ways, as I described. But again, we created. I mean, we create certain in El Salvador. They created certain land reform programs, some job programs for the for demobilizing former guerrillas. But and I worked in El Salvador for a long time as either as a consultant for IDB or for the United Nations, whatever. But that was also that was always the domain of the people dealing with the peace process. The main business of the state was going. It was totally different. So if you go to talk with the Banco de la Reserva, which like the Salvadorian Fed, I mean, if you talk peace, it was like talking Mandarin to them. It was not the problem. It was not the problem, for example, for the people in charge of the housing, the housing. So you create this kind of special programs for this special condition, as if peace was kind of another sector within the wide array of policies a state has tackled, but not a cross-cutting problem. So you have macroeconomic policies totally divorced with the issue of what do we do to include all these guys. So my hunch, Juan Sebastian, which I'm so happy to hear you, to see you and see you free. For me, I mean, really, your bravery, we have followed it very close in Central America. The fact is that, so at the state level, we said, well, those are the peace guys. And the policies are here. But also, I always, of course, it's very difficult to, and to dialogue with the people you don't trust or with people who had killed your cousin. But at one point, you have to do that. And I was always struck by how the two parties didn't talk. They were actually in symbolic war. I mean, it was so difficult to create kind of a coalition for certain policies. So if Arena, the right wing, said we should do this, you knew the Farabundo Martí will oppose nail and tooth in the same thing. So that's why I think in the case of El Salvador, even a much more far-reaching agreement than the Zapua agreement, which is 1.5 pages long, and it's kind of just saying, well, let's end this war and let's pray for the best. But the new government, I would say Cristiani was a very interesting figure, but Cristiani had no money to implement anything. And I must say, Arena had this partisanship. Whatever thing I am going to invest is because it is going to be for me. So one of the things that you have to bring into the table at one point, not only the guerrillas and the government, the powerful actors. And you have to ask difficult, are you going to accept tax reform or not? They cannot say, well, to do what? Okay, let's agree. But if there's no tax reform, these are states with pressing demands and no capability to implement policies. But again, the peace track was separate. There was the Fondo Salvadoreño, the fees, and this and whatever, but always this kind of the peace guys. And so I think one of the lessons is not to accept these separate tracks. It was a normal policy making and those peace special problems. But in case in Nicaragua, well, your aunt was the first democratic president, and she had nothing. I mean, she had to go to scratch. So And there was no, and international actors were missing. I mean, they were not there. They had put a lot of money into war, but when peace came, who was paying for a lot of things? So I think one of the things that international community really has to pick up part of the bill at least.
Thank you. Jorge, congratulations on the talk. It was, as usual, very, very, very impressive. I would like you to push you on two things with respect to your talk. In a way, you tell a story about this lost opportunity as a story about origins, right? There was something wrong in the initial moment of peace that had to do with a lack of vision, or maybe a lack of ambition on the part of political elites about understanding that all of these things were connected and a kind of an integral solution was necessary. But let me push you a little bit on this argument on two fronts, right? One is, it seems to me that probably if we went back 70 years and you look at the region, say in 1950, and you correlate the situation of countries in 1950 with the situation of the countries today, probably we would find a strong correlation, right? And if that's the case, there has to be, potentially there has to be something else that goes beyond that story that you are telling about that moment of the 1980s. So that's one question. The other question is kind of on the opposite end, which is, I agree with your argument, right? In the sense that thinking about these things in a disconnected way probably is a failure, not only in Central America, but in Latin America more broadly. But at the same time, I wonder if we are being a little unfair with the elites that we criticize, right? Because how do you make policy, or how do you attempt to make policy if you think about all of these things connected, right? Aren't we be too demanding with the kinds of problems that they need to confront?
Thank you, Aníbal, as usual, very intelligent questions. On the first one, I focus on agency. The structural restrictions, I knew they are in place, but I focus in this talk on agency because that was an extraordinary window. Because I would say, well, you know what, we are condemned by structure, our lagging, our culture, whatever. We will not find our way out. But that was, the whole point is that was an extraordinary political moment. Either because in El Salvador, there was a stalemate. No one had won. So, I mean, when this guy, when I told that he told me now is the first time, he really meant, it was not, we were drinking in a very intimate setting. He was a prominent member of the government. And he grasped the idea that extraordinary moments, you either able to springboard into a different political trajectory. It's like a critical juncture in terms of institutionalism, or not. And the more that you fail to recognize the opportunity or to act upon the opportunity, the forces of the structural inertia settles down. So, for example, when the Farabundo Martí came to power 20 or almost 15 years later, not only they didn't have any program, they went to power to actually to improvise. If you talk to the secretary of the president, they know the worst enemy were their own comrades. They didn't know what to do with power. But even if they knew what to do, 20 years, there is no surprise. Everybody was already kind of in their place. And so the window for doing things had narrowed so much. So my point is that in this case, Aníbal, I chose to to pose a question is, how do we recognize an extraordinary political opportunity when you are in front of it, and what you have to do? And you have very little time, because again, inertia will settle down. So the structural restrictions for every new government is even stronger, until, for example, in the case of Salvador, Bukele comes and makes a big disruption. But not a disruption you would like, maybe, from the peace and human development and democratic perspective. So my answer is, extraordinary opportunities, look at the agencies, look at the agents. What do they do? What do they know? How do they frame the issue? And some of them knew what they have at hand, and many didn't. Regarding your second question, I would say, anyway, that one has to think complexity, not because one has to act upon 100 things at the same time, but you have to be able to connect 5 or 6 dots. And in connecting them, you inaugurate a new trajectory. You don't know what's going to happen along the road. But for example, if there is, you don't need to have like the program, like the Germans, when they have this kind of government and they have this coalition and they write this book, 300 pages of what they are going to do. We're not Germans, we are Latin Americans. We don't know what's going to be, what's going to happen tomorrow. And in short term is for us 24 hours, and long term is 3 months. So understanding that, now nonetheless, you have to think complexity and ask you a further question: which are the key things that can change, can allow me change trajectory? For example, I would say building what Modesto Henry Ruiz, which he said, we need from day one to create an independent judiciary. It was not a second order task, it's the first day. Okay, that's something I'm gonna do different. In the case of Costa Rica, at some point after a civil war, they, for example, abolished the army. Okay, you don't know what that is going to lead, but you know that is a disruption that changes a lot of things. So maybe you say, okay, democracy, two things. Human development, connect fiscal policy with social policy. What, tax reform? Well, I'm gonna do tax reform. So it's not a long kind of German type of program, because we are not Germans, but it's a much more concrete things of the key issues that you have to, if you are going to have 24 hours to do something, what are you going to do for 3 months? So, because then there's no element of surprise. So that's my point. My point is not that you are going to do everything, that you are kind of in the Notre Dame planning the whole new country, because to kind of this refoundation of a country is a total mistake, because to an integral refoundation means that you have to kind of do some sort of tabula rasa, and to do that you have to have integral power, absolute power. God forbids, even myself, which I trust myself, I wouldn't trust me to have absolute power. So the aim of complexity is not trying to refound society on totally new grounds, but in understanding that the judiciary, independent judiciary, if you want to abolish the army, a small country, why do you want an army, whatever, and then you remove a factor, an actor that in the future can block you from things. Judiciary, fiscal policy, how do we incorporate, for example, improving education? Not special programs. You have to have special programs for the people who fought the war, but you need to normalize a different way of doing things. So my point that is, forget about this integral, holistic pretension or mission to say, well, this is 500 measures I'm going to take. No. What are your 5 or 6 key actions that adding up may be an incomplete program, and for sure it's an incomplete program, but change. Basically, what it does, what they do is to use the critical juncture to create a new trajectory. And then, I mean, then politics as normal steps in, and you don't know whether some governments will do this and the other, but the past or some foundations of the past have been removed. That's my take. Think complexity is not integral. It's just studying that there are certain things that are connected.
So unfortunately, we're out of time for the formal part of our program today, but I just want to again, thank you so much for a really compelling, thoughtful talk that I think not only has applicability for Latin America and places that are engaging in peace processes, but even for, I think, our own country here in the United States. So I really appreciate your contributions today. But the conversation doesn't need to end. We're going to welcome you all to a reception here in the Great Hall. Also want to, again, thank the Kellogg Institute for co-sponsoring this event today. And I also want to invite you all to join us again here in the auditorium on April 4th at 11 a.m. to hear Dr. Tracy West deliver the 26th annual lecture on dialogues on nonviolence, religion, and peace, which will be followed by a lunch and conversation across the hall. Again, thank you so much for being here this afternoon, and please join us in the Great Hall for a reception.